An Iranian missile struck the Ali al-Salem air base in Kuwait. Canadian Armed Forces personnel were stationed at that base. The Canadian government said nothing. Not that day. Not the next day. Not for 11 days. Ottawa stayed silent while a war was burning, while Carney was shifting his position 3 times across 3 continents, while Liberal MPs were demanding answers in caucus, while the opposition was asking where the Prime Minister stood. 11 days of silence. About a missile that hit a base where Canadian soldiers were sleeping. When the Canadian press finally asked the Department of National Defence about the strike on March 6th, they waited a week for a response. The answer, when it came, was 3 sentences. We are aware of reports of strikes in the vicinity of Ali al-Salem Air Base. For operational security reasons, we do not discuss assessments of damage or impacts to military facilities. Based on events since February 28th, all Canadian Armed Forces members in the region are safe. That was it. No acknowledgement that Canadians had been in danger. No explanation of why the public was not told. No accountability from a government that had called its own Iran debate in Parliament and still said nothing about this. Conservative defense critic James Beeson called it shameful. And then came March 12th. The same morning that Carney's office was facing questions about Kuwait, the Prime Minister flew to Yellowknife. He stood inside a hangar at the 440 Transport Squadron base and announced the largest military investment in Canada's modern history. $35 billion. For Arctic bases, Arctic highways, Arctic ports, Arctic radar, Arctic sovereignty. The announcement was real. The money was real. The locations were real. Yellowknife, Inuvik, Iqaluit, Goose Bay. New operational hubs at Whitehorse and Resolute. New support nodes at Cambridge Bay and Rankin Inlet. An 800-kilometer Mackenzie Valley highway connecting Yellowknife to the Arctic Ocean. Carney stood before the cameras and said the words that his government had been building toward for weeks. In this new era, we cannot rely on other nations for our security and prosperity. It was his clearest statement of Canadian strategic independence since taking office. And it landed on the same day his government was refusing to explain why Canadians spent 11 days not knowing their soldiers had been under missile attack. Here is what makes that timing impossible to ignore. The Kuwait strike was not the only question about Canadian military presence in this war. On March 1st, CBC News reported that as many as 18 Canadian military personnel were on exchange with U.S. forces in Qatar and Bahrain when the strikes on Iran began. Canadian officers embedded inside the combined Aerospace Operations Center. Canadian soldiers at the U.S. Fifth Fleet headquarters in Bahrain. Inside the command structures that planned and coordinated the operation. Retired Major General Dennis Thompson told CBC that Canadian soldiers on exchange with U.S. Central Command gave intelligence support for the strikes and were, in his words, directly involved in targeting. The Department of National Defense denied it. But the question that former Foreign Affairs Minister Lloyd Axworthy put on the table was one the denial could not close. You cannot embed Canadian officers in U.S. warfighting headquarters, plug Canadian intelligence into targeting processes, then wash your hands when missiles fly. If Canadian personnel helped plan, analyze, or enable an operation, Canada is implicated, whether or not a Canadian finger was on the trigger. That is not a fringe argument. That is a former Canadian foreign minister describing the legal and moral reality of how modern military exchange programs work. And it sits directly alongside a prime minister who endorsed the strikes from Mumbai on day 1, called them a likely violation of international law on day 4, refused to rule out Canadian participation on day 7, and then said Canada will never participate on day 10. 4 positions. 10 days. 18 soldiers already embedded in the command structure that launched the war. Now think about what $35 billion means in that context. Trump had been hammering Canada on defense spending for months. The pressure was structural, relentless, and directly tied to CUSMA. Pay more for your own defense or face consequences at the trade table. The $35 billion announcement drew from a pool of money set aside 4 years ago. Most of it, approximately $32 billion, was already committed under previous planning. But the timing of when Carney chose to announce it, package it, and fly to Yellowknife to stand in front of cameras on March 12th was a political decision. The same day the Kuwait silence was becoming public. The same day the question of what Canadian soldiers were doing inside U.S. targeting operations was back in the headlines. 1 week before Carney's trip to Norway to observe NATO Arctic war games above the Arctic Circle. 1 week before meetings with Nordic leaders to deepen defense cooperation independent of Washington. The announcement served 2 audiences simultaneously. For Canadians watching the news at home, it was sovereignty. Canada defending its own terrain. Canada not relying on other nations. Canada building the true North, strong and free. For Washington, it was compliance. Canada spending on defense. Canada meeting the NATO threshold Trump had been demanding. Canada demonstrating that the pressure was working. Whether it was one or the other, or both, is the question nobody in Ottawa is answering directly. What is documentable is this sequence. February 28th, Carney endorses Iran strikes from Mumbai. March 3rd, Canadian soldiers confirmed at bases struck by Iran. Government says nothing. March 3rd, Defense Minister confirms Canadian military presence in the region. No casualties. March 6th, Canadian press asks about Kuwait strike. No response for a week. March 9th, Liberal caucus meets in person. MPs demand answers. March 10, Carney attends question period. Conservatives grill him on inflation and affordability, not just Iran. He announces Canada will never participate in the offensive. March 12th, Carney flies to Yellowknife. Announces $35 billion. Faces questions about Kuwait for the first time on camera. His answer in Yellowknife was brief. All members of the Canadian forces in the region are safe and sound. We are not engaged in offensive actions and we will not be. He did not explain the 11-day silence. He did not address what Canadian exchange officers were doing inside the targeting command structure. He did not explain why Parliament debated the war for 2 nights without a single government official mentioning that an Iranian missile had already struck a base housing Canadian soldiers. He got on a plane and flew to Norway. The $35 billion announcement will dominate the headlines. The runways and hangars and highways and radar towers are real. The investment in Arctic sovereignty is genuine. But the question that follows Carney to Yellowknife, to Norway, to London, and back to Ottawa is the same one the caucus was asking on March 9th. What did Canadians know? When were they supposed to know it? And what exactly were Canadian soldiers doing inside the command structure of a war their Prime Minister first supported, then regretted, then called illegal, then said Canada would never join? 11 days. 1 missile. 18 soldiers. $35 billion. And a Prime Minister who, as of March 13th, still has not answered the one question that started all of it. Why didn't you tell us?